Hey, MBA hopefuls, we are on the air with MBA Waves, your weekly vidcast talking all things business and education. Today, we are back on the show with Andrew Jack, the global education editor at the Financial Times, on this very first episode of 2024 after a little bit of a break. Happy New Year, everyone, by the way. Today, we're going to get into the methodology behind this year's big winners and why, some surprises and trends, and how to use the business school rankings in your own MBA journey. I'm your host for today, Eric Lucrezia, joined by my co-hosts, Bara Sapir and Krithika Srinivasan. How you doing, ladies? How we doing?
Amazing. Hi.
Good to be back. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Don't forget, of course, to like and subscribe if you want more great MBA Waves content. Andrew, you've been with the Financial Times for a whopping 33 years now. It's fantastic. And I would say you must know the organization pretty well and its prestigious rankings by heart. Welcome back, Andrew. How are you?
Thank you. Thanks for the dating of me. Although I've only been doing education stuff for about 5 or 6 years, so I'm still a novice compared to a lot of you folks, I'm sure.
Well, you've stuck around with the organization for a while, so it's clear that you know a thing or two. We got to meet each other in person for the first time at the AGAC conference last summer. And so it's good to see you again, even though online. Look, we all await the FT rankings each year, every February. So to start us off, why don't you tell us what's new this year? Any big surprises, any changes? What's on your mind?
Well, I mean, the first thing is, yet again, we've gone through this tremendous exercise. It's a huge amount of work for my colleagues in particular who do all the data collection and analysis. There's an awful lot also of back and forth talking with schools about eligibility criteria and particular kind of issues around definitions. So it's a real considerable and intensive exercise. Of course, there's the global MBA ranking itself, which just came out and is, of course, a bit of a flagship of a lot of the business education coverage that we do. And we can talk about a lot of the details on that, but also, of course, there's a whole magazine with a series of articles accompanying the rankings talking about bigger trends. And also, incidentally, this year, we launched a sort of special section looking at US business education in general, and actually in particular, even a sort of, if you like, lighter data crunch exercise, looking at some of the leading undergraduate business majors in the US to kind of do a bit of a compare and contrast, given obviously one issue that we're talking about more and more is stagnation of MBA demand, particularly in the US and Europe. But meanwhile, a kind of big growth, of course, in more specialized master's programs and a substantial uptick in business as an undergraduate major. So we wanted to provide that sort of full richness, if you like, but it was all of that alongside the rankings that lots of folks focused on. And each year there are some ups and downs. Wharton re-established itself in the top place this year, and then you've got a great distribution with a number of other leading US schools and European schools, of course, in top positions. But the thing I always try to emphasize, and I'm sure we'll discuss this more, is that, the overall FT ranking, if you like, is one attempt to distill in one way and using some of the weightings that we consider important. But this is really a tool for individuals, whether it's counselors, applicants, faculty, recruiters, and others who engage with business schools to use the full range of data that we're presenting and try and develop and analyze and sort of do bespoke work to come up with the schools that matter most for their interests and students and so on. And that, again, no radical changes in our methodology this year. We did a bit of tweaking to further enhance the work we're capturing around climate-related issues, including notably the introduction of Scope 3 criteria for carbon audits in schools, and we can talk about that. But the fundamental issues and the biggest weightings remain, of course, around outcomes led by salary and salary increase, and then research, diversity, including gender, for faculty and students alike, and the nature of the international cohorts. They're some of the key data points that we look at.
Bara, before you ask the question you wanted to ask, I know you have something lined up. Just a little bit of a follow-up comment and question. You're absolutely right, Andrew. There's a whole rich wealth of data that you guys produce each year, and a lot of people just look at the surface rankings, just that numbered list, right? And I think it would be so amiss to not go deeper. You have what we call like the sub rankings, right? All like best MBA for women in business, best for entrepreneurship, and so forth and so forth. Like this is really valuable data, depending on what, as an applicant, an MBA applicant, your goals are professionally. Some of the sub rankings might actually be more important to you than some of the others. There's also a lot changing right now. We have a lot of schools in the US opening up Masters in Management programs, right? MIM programs like Booth. We have the LBS has just launched their 1-year MBA program recently. So that's exciting as well. So there's a lot going on. And then if you look at the testing side of things, both the GRE and GMAT, like two pillars of MBA admissions, have totally revamped their tests. So I'm wondering what that impact, if that has any effect on the results. As you said, the methodology hasn't changed much, yet we've seen quite a bit of change in who's in the top 10, who's in the top 20. Every year I do this kind of tally of, let's say distribution of what schools, what countries, and continents. Like this year, we have 47 schools in North America, 34 in Europe, and 19 represented in Asia. And I think that's a record for Europe, if I'm not mistaken. We have 4 European schools in the top 10, the other 6 being in the US. And if you look at top 20, it goes up to 7 from Europe, which all this is very interesting, I think, where I think it's a departure a bit from some of the kind of like old guard, some of the most elite prestigious schools known as M7, or you could say Ivy League or so forth, that are typically in top 10. And now we're seeing some newer players. I think is very interesting for, anyone looking at graduate management education. So my follow-up question was, how many people are on the team that do all this fantastic data crunching?
Oh, well, we have, apart from me, who kind of helps oversee and engage and interpret, we have a team in-house of 3 statisticians and colleagues who work on all of the practicalities, and then 2 external part-time consultants who work on database management. So, 4 to 5, I suppose, at least full-time equivalent, which is, of course, pretty small when, sometimes you hear well, not only the size and the investment that the business schools themselves put into the whole process for ours and for other rankings, but also, I smile sometimes when I hear external people talking about rankings agencies. There may be some organizations that have a much larger staff, but the FTs is certainly pretty slimline, and I think they achieve, a great amount given the limited resources that they have. And you're absolutely right, Eric, as you were saying. I mean, you have to present data in some form, and to present a sort of aggregated version as we do with the weights that we provide is, I think, a really useful starting point. And it's something that gives a sense and reflects our feedback from all sorts of players, including the schools, and most notably from the students themselves about what they consider some of the most important elements in their decision making. But yes, if you go to our rankings.ft.com website, as you say, you can download the spreadsheets, you can play around up ranking and down ranking, selecting or removing a whole bunch of the different metrics that go into these. And that's absolutely something I'd recommend. If you're a student in, let's say, China who wants to study in Europe, if you're an American who wants to remain somewhere within the US, if you're interested in, courses of different duration, if you've got certain upper or lower thresholds on pricing, if you're interested in academic research in a particular area, or the kind of the intellectual depth, as it were, of faculty, if you're focused on sustainability issues, you name it, there are so many different factors that it really is important for folks to get into the details. I think that's absolutely fundamental.
Absolutely.
So I wish I was a fly in the room when you're all, I guess, the handful of people that are working on this, Andrew. And I know that last year you had introduced changes in the methodology, and you had the alumni network, you've got carbon footprint and the sector diversity. And I'm curious, what is your methodology this year with adding these new things?
So as I say, this year, i.e. the ranking that's just been published, there's pretty minor tweaks compared to last year, 2023, when we did a reasonably significant overhaul. I should say, our methodology is totally transparent. You'll find it in the articles online, in the magazine, and elsewhere. But essentially, stepping back, to be eligible, schools have to want to participate because we require some data from them that isn't publicly available. They have to also be accredited by AACSB or EQUIS, EFMD. So they pass a certain sort of benchmark of quality. And then the data that we use overall is derived from two sources. One is that's provided by the business schools themselves, including their faculty lists and information on their class cohorts and the research that's being done and so on. And the second part, which comes from a survey of their alumni 3 years after graduating. And of course, sometimes you get a few surprises because it can be challenging always to get the response rates required to make sure that we have statistically significant results. So that sometimes creates a few tensions and dropouts in and out each year. But fundamentally, once we've collected and cleaned the data, we allocate weights to those key different factors. As I've said, the outcomes measures remain for us the most important, starting with overall level of earnings 3 years post-graduating, increase in earnings compared with before students began their MBA from their previous job, levels of promotion internally, and so on. And then we look at a wide variety of other factors, as you say, gender diversity and international diversity amongst faculty and students, the research output in high quality academic journals, whether faculty or what proportion have PhDs. And then we look at factors including, as you said, which we introduced last year, looking at these whole areas of sustainability or responsible business education, where we've got two metrics, one around whether the schools, their physical plant, their operations have set a net zero emissions target, and whether they've published a recent carbon emissions audit. Of course, business schools are not the largest emitters of carbon by any means in the world, but when you think of the multiplier effect of what their graduates will go on to do as entrepreneurs, as executives, as fund managers, and when you think about the importance of the business school on campus as a sandbox, if you like, for experimentation of new ideas and a demonstration point to show that faculty, staff, students are walking the talk around climate as one of the biggest issues of our time, we think that's pretty important. So the one nuance we introduced this year was to add in a measure around the carbon of scope 3, which, as you'll know, is essentially not only your own energy generation and emissions, but it's actually the supply chain of those that you engage with. And so that caused a few bumps. A number of the European schools which have been in that space longer perform well, but also we saw some very good results by US schools. But all of those are relatively small weightings overall. As I say, the big picture tries to present this holistic view that touches all of those key factors.
Speaking about eco-friendly, that did make me think initially, some of those European schools might fare better, but I also don't imagine it being the largest metric by any means. This is generally not why people go to business school for the most part. But
no, it's a relatively small weighting, but it's interesting. It does show some interesting things. I mean, for example, Darden University of Virginia performed very well, and in fact, we've written on them before. As you'll know, they've actually effectively got their own solar power plant across campus. Now, obviously, schools that have big existing infrastructure, schools that are part of wider universities that may have, scientific and engineering faculties that have a large emissions output, of course, have some big structural challenges compared to schools that may be a standalone or have had a very substantial donor contribution and it's allowed them to build a state-of-the-art new facility, for example. But each school has pros and cons, things that work in its favor and things that work against it. Again, it's a way to kind of try and measure and track progress across the piece.
Andrew, just a logistical question. How long do you devote to creating this rankings? Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? How long are you in the weeds here with the creation?
Well, if you like, it's a sort of ongoing process. I mean, of course, at the moment, if we start from the moment of publication, there's, of course, kind invitations like yours and wider discussions to interpret the latest output and to explain the context and so on. But there is, throughout the year, my colleagues are handling inquiries from new schools who want to join, existing ones who are kind of trying to understand where they sit. I continue to sort of have wide-ranging discussions with schools about evolutions in the metrics, but also the presentation of the data, and then the wider editorial coverage that goes around it. In terms of the actual data collection and analysis exercise, that's really over a 3 or 4 month period, essentially, from initial alerts to schools and invitations for them to participate through to the full data collection with the 2 questionnaires that I mentioned to schools and alumni, and then a number of weeks work with colleagues cleaning the data, analyzing it, pulling together the Z scores that allow for the ranking, and then actually, because we have a print magazine for the MBA, all of that has to be done about a month before actual publication, given the lead times required for printing and layout and so on, for the tables and the wider articles. So it's a pretty intense year-round process, but really with a kind of intensification, if you like, on the actual specific annual ranking that probably begins around about November each year before publication in February.
Thanks. That's interesting.
So I want to ask you a follow-up here to what you mentioned before. So there are some dropouts, and I think that causes a lot of tension and, of course, a lot of jubilation when some of the top programs win. And can you tell us more about why would a school drop out?
Well, I mean, first of all, again, we're very grateful to the schools because really most of the significant players do want to participate. That's hopefully a recognition of the value of our rankings and their desire to be transparent. Of course, it creates some tensions where there are expectations, reasonable or unreasonable, from the governance bodies, the alumni, and others engaged in particular schools around the specific positioning. But, we've long stressed that as we said, the ordinal, the overall aggregate rankings, if you like, should only be a part of the piece. And that equally, inevitably, when you're pulling in new data points, when things vary over time, there will be some bouncing around. Several years ago, I introduced the idea of tiers. So we have 3 or 4 tiers of schools within our top 100 ranked, if you like. And in many ways, I think, those in the tier 1, let's say, should think more about themselves as being a group of peers rather than focusing necessarily too obsessionally on whether they've gone up by 1 or 2 individual positions in the ranking, for instance. The second thing I'd say is, as I say, we measure 100 leading global MBAs that are provided around the world. All of these 100 schools are extremely high quality. How many are there? Tens of thousands potentially of total schools and MBAs around the world. So 100 is a very elite group. So even to be in them, I think, is strong credit to their performance and how they're regarded. As to the individual ups and downs, we always get questions from schools and alumni about, well, how come my school has risen 5 or dropped 10 or whatever? So one thing is, as I say, sadly, occasionally we have periods where a school and their alumni are unable to generate sufficient responses for us to be robust in the findings, and unfortunately they have to step out. That did happen to Wharton last year, but then they came back with real fervor, as you saw, to regain their position in the top slot. A few other schools that's happened to this year, and it happens always, and we're always very interested in ideas about how we can boost response rates or find other sources of data to try to avoid that happening. The other thing, though, I think to say is, I see a lot of commentary about, these rankings can't be serious because school X isn't in there or school Y has dropped 30 places. And everybody knows that that school is, one of the top 3. Therefore, these rankings aren't credible. The reality is, what's that judgment based on? It's based on a historical perspective that, if you like, is a bit of a circular logic. School X has appeared in the top of the rankings, ours or somebody else's, for a number of years. Therefore, it must always be there. The reality is obviously we're taking a snapshot in time based on the data that's available, based on the aggregation of the data points that we consider important as a high-level point of entry. But let's take Stanford, for example, this year, that dropped somewhat in the overall ranking. Nonetheless, go into the details, you'll see it's the highest school for alumni earnings. It also tops, incidentally, for alumni assessments of aims achieved and the quality of their alumni networks as the alumni themselves rank them. So, to me, that isn't a mark of failure. That's a mark of nuance, and many schools that say, but look, we've done really well on this, that, and the other factor. How come we've dropped, for example, in a particular year? Well, one of the responses is because this is a relative ranking. That school may have done lots of great things, but then many of their peers have too, of course. I mean, this is the home of competition, a business school, and everyone's looking over each other's shoulders and trying to consider best practices. So again, I would say, don't dismiss out of hand when you see some slightly counterintuitive changes in the absolute ranking. Don't dismiss the ranking itself. Go in and look at the details and reflect on it. And hopefully some of those sort of moves, provide some value as well. I mean, if frankly, our ranking or others came out with pretty much the same rank order every year for all of the schools, what would be the point of it? We're trying to measure progress and evolution. And if sometimes a name leaps out because it's popped up or it's dropped down, then that should be the starting point to interrogate the data in more detail.
Andrew, it's great what you're saying. I mean, you give so much insight to not only us, but to our audience. And people, I think, are often very curious what is going on behind the scenes. It's interesting to know that it's just a small team. It's interesting to know the time frame that it takes for you guys to produce X, Y, Z. I definitely, people have opinions about rankings one way or the other. I guess with the credit of the Financial Times and when the work you do, it stirs up a lot of excitement, and that's all very good. One of the comments I hear is, well, how could it be credible if, X school, who's like, let's say, typically a top 10 school, has slid down by 15 spots? Is that realistic? No, I don't think that's what's happening. I think what's happening is other schools are starting to do some good things that is bringing that up higher. And when you crunch all the numbers, that's the way it lands. And I also like the fact that you call it a snapshot in time. I think that's a very interesting way to remember what it is. And also the fact that often our impressions of a school are based on historical impressions and data and so forth, that we have this idea that X school is of this prestige, and things change. things do change. You also spoke about in the methodology how schools need to report on certain data. You mentioned alumni surveys and how Wharton, they went from #1 to off the charts, like non-existent, right? Fell off entirely because of exactly that. Not enough alumni responded. And now they're back in #1 again. What is some advice you would give to schools so they can help encourage alumni to engage more in these surveys to ensure that doesn't happen?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one we're constantly reflecting on. I mean, I think obviously, I think alumni see the value of their school. Clearly, they made a big commitment of time and money to go there, and so like with support for college football, which is lifelong in the States, of course. In the same way, obviously, you're typically proud of the school you went to, and you want to see it continue to perform well. So, of course, we absolutely want an honest, objective, representative snapshot of the data items. And incidentally, we also do a periodic audit using an external auditor to kind of make sure all of the data is being provided honestly and in line with our guidelines. But I think the more that alumni themselves, but also the schools, can sort of stress the importance and the value of rankings, and indeed of the wider achievements that they're delivering on, and build that alumni community in a rich way, the better. Of course, rankings and questionnaires are part of it, and I think there are practical issues that can be discussed in terms of, perhaps the evolution from communication with alumni through email to the use of WhatsApp groups or social media or other ways in which they keep in touch. I think, I don't know if I can draw a direct correlation, but I suspect the alumni networks that are seen as the most valuable, that are delivering the most, will probably do better overall, therefore, in delivering, for example, on response rates to surveys. And I think there that it's interesting, in Europe historically perhaps that's been more complicated, but you're seeing more and more schools engaging with alumni networks, not only in if I can put it a slightly sort of crude mercantile way, just simply for fundraising, or even just purely for socializing, but to kind of richen and deepen that lifelong engagement, so that you're using it for networking, for advice, for continued connection between alumni and faculty, the
Also,
outreach, of
alumni
course, to
interviews,
potential
right?
applicants. Sorry.
Some of the schools use alumni interviews as part of the admissions process, and
Absolutely, yeah, and
freshmen.
and some of the advice we always give, and I'm sure you do, is that you as an individual potential applicant, of course, reach out to the school, of course, use the rankings, of course, read widely, but do try to make contact with current and former students directly through LinkedIn or other ways, in order to get their advice, and try to build up a much more holistic and personalized view of the strengths and the challenges and so on, that might explain and justify whether to do and where to do an MBA. And the final thing on that sort of cultivation and the initiatives by schools, I think, is we're seeing quite rightly a growth in the idea of thinking of the alumni networks as a place for continuing and lifelong learning. So how to continue to engage faculty and their insights and share their research, how to engage alumni in whether it's coming back to classes or doing courses in some form online, that sort of maintains and builds those connections and loyalties. And that's certainly something that we're trying to track, including this metric we included last year on, as I mentioned, the alumni assessment of their own school's alumni network, because that clearly is a signal that we're hearing, that the value that provides.
Thanks.
I really like, what FT brought for the climate change, especially, and also diversity. So diversity and sustainability were two important metrics last year. So how do you think schools have responded to this change, and what trends are you seeing?
So I think on the whole, schools have responded very positively. Almost every week I see some sort of new initiative, whether it's the creation of a Institute of Sustainability, an endowed chair in climate change. We saw a whole series of primarily US schools after the most recent COP meeting, sort of releasing a lot of publicly available free resources for learning about climate, as we had done a couple of years before with many of the European and now some of the Middle Eastern schools as well. So there's this growth in wanting to share insight. I see it in the continued interest around a whole series of networks around academia, new journals, new conferences, specialist networks, the network that's run around for a while, of course, of impact finance and sustainability, the responsible research in business and management, the affiliation with the UN Prime Network for principles of responsible management education. And both, of course, Equis and AACSB are incorporating these wider societal measures into their assessment processes. So, huge growth within business schools by faculty, from recruiters, employers, and particularly from students. I think, that's a very, very powerful trend. And even if there's some pushback that we're seeing, particularly in the US now, where the whole thing has become somewhat politicized, it remains kind of existential. So it's a really important area for the future. One of the challenges in measuring these things in a sort of consistent, quantifiable, effective way. So, as you say, we included these measures as at least a proxy, looking at school operations and emissions. We've tried to do it looking at course content. We're exploring ways to do it around faculty output. We've also explored it a little bit around graduate employment sectors, but that's very, very complicated to try to measure in a consistent and robust way. And that's why we also launched, and we published the most recent version last month. We have this responsible Business Education Award that tries to showcase impactful academic research, projects with students and alumni, operations of schools, and the overall degree to which they're trying to integrate into their teaching and operations and learning sustainability and responsible business. I think that's an area we'll continue to see growing in most schools, including in the US.
Interesting. Andrew, since the Financial Times collects data over that 3-year period from graduation, is there any commentary or insight that you can give about how COVID has affected any of the outcomes?
Well, I think we did see a little bit of a slowing down in salary increases. It's quite a nuanced picture, and it depends on the country and the region that you look at. Obviously, the wider systemic data that we've seen, like the surveys of numbers of those expressing interest in applying to MBAs, has somewhat stagnated. Perhaps that reflects a little bit of a sort of change in the nature of the job market. It was, of course, very hot. It's now somewhat calming down, as we've seen, particularly in big tech and also in the consulting sectors, even in the last few weeks and months. Of course, as we know, business education is often counter-cyclical. So maybe that's good news for the schools, even if bad news for some of those who are currently in employment or looking at graduate prospects. But those have been some pretty big evolutions in the last few years. And as Eric was saying earlier, of course, we're seeing this explosion in specialized courses and different approaches, whether it's BU and some others that have done much lower price points on online courses in business education. Chicago, of course, which also is now got this Masters in Management course and is looking at sort of modular approaches. So you could do that and then take some of those credits to upgrade, if you like, to an MBA later down the road. So I think we're going to see a lot more fragmentation, targeting, price pressure, for example, all of which is going to be affecting the nature of the providers and the core content of insights that are being provided.
Thanks.
So, Andrew, I've been talking with some of my colleagues, some fellow AGAC members, consultants who work with MBA hopefuls all around the world. And some of them, only work with people applying to schools in the States. And so they don't necessarily look at the FT. Also, the Americans represent a large percentage of MBA applicants, along with Indians, Chinese, and so forth. So the MBA world, especially traditionally, has been very American-centric. Obviously, we know it's been spreading around the world, and there's some fantastic schools as per this year's results. I was making the case for showing interest in the FT rankings anyway, even though they're only Americans applying to American schools, where another ranking, US News, might be more relevant to them. And I was like, well, think about it. It's also interesting to know what people from other parts of the world think about that school. Like, how does that school fare compared to to schools and programs in other countries? Also, if that person who thinks they want to be in the US now, maybe in 5-10 years, they'd like to work in another country. So I think it's always interesting to have that information. And I don't know if you do any sort of cross comparison, like what Poets and Quants does, where they compare various rankings. But do you do that kind of stuff also? Do you compare across other ranking organizations?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're always interested, of course, in what others are doing, and whether it's other publishers, for example, or whether it's broader data sets that exist. I think we're seeing an explosion in all of those sorts of insights and data points. And, as I was saying earlier, it's a kind of constant process of reflecting, of seeing what else is out there, of questioning whether there are tweaks we can make to our methodology or new data points to bring in, or whether existing ones are outdated in some form. So yeah, I mean, absolutely. In terms of the geographies, I mean, of course, you're right. The US began the MBA, and it's still a huge share of the global market. But the very idea of the FT launching now some quarter of a century ago, its global MBA, was precisely because basically of the globalization of business and trade and indeed travel. And we saw an increasing demand and appetite from different parts of the world and from business schools in different places to respond to that, and therefore a real desire for global benchmarking. And I think, you're right, of course, there are many schools in the US that have got a very strong regional anchoring. A lot of their students will come from and intend to remain in, if you like, that kind of area around those schools. But there are many others, of course, that are heavily and indeed increasingly interested in engaging with international students. And in the same way, I think there's a large and probably growing number of US potential students who also want to benchmark and consider elsewhere. We talked earlier, whether it's the MBA itself or whether it's Masters in Management and other qualifications, to go and live,
for example, right?
Excuse me?
If they're exchange programs, right? They might
for
be
exchange. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it could be for part of a degree. It could also be that you choose to do your entire degree somewhere else. If you're interested in India or China, the sort of the huge economic growth of that part of the world. If you're interested in the context of Europe, where there's significant innovation and cultural variety and diversity, if you're focused on the costs of study, of course, many other parts of the world might provide both a more varied experience and even a cheaper one, and possibly one of shorter duration than doing a classic 2-year US MBA, for example. And of course, you're almost guaranteed to have a greater variety of nationalities and backgrounds amongst the student cohorts, going to, often obviously much smaller and therefore kind of more open markets and countries elsewhere in the world. So yes, I think exactly, even if you're not necessarily interested in going abroad to study, I think there's a huge degree of movement, of course, amongst faculty, between schools. We just had the deputy head of the London Business School, who's about to become the dean at Ivy in Canada, for instance. There's lots of back and forth. Of course, Sumitra Dito, who is now at the Oxford Said School, who was previously at a number of schools in the US. So there's a huge degree of benchmarking that's required in what is, around the academic space, a very globalized world in terms of ideas and talent and so on. So I think for all purposes, and for all sorts of users, it's really valuable, even if you're not directly in the short term going to be affected yourself, in a way of a choice of where you want to be based, to actually see what others are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Just having a look outside of your bubble and seeing the way other schools and other people do things is always interesting to see. Like I said, even for exchange programs, if you want to be in the US, but if you want to do a semester exchange somewhere else, it's good to know what are the options out there. I think having that kind of diversity in your profile is always an added value, even if you want to stay in the US for whatever reason.
Yeah, exactly. In the same way as, for example, the AACSB's got its annual Dean's meeting at the end of this month in Barcelona. They're moving to different parts of the world to reflect these huge global interconnected networks of academics, of schools, and of students. And so I think, the rankings and the wider coverage that's provided editorially of business education globally is a really valuable contribution as well.
Sure. And you mentioned cost, by the way, and some people say, oh, if it's X tuition, dollar or euro price, whatever, they see, oh, you're getting 2 years, you're getting that much bang for your buck. Whereas other people see a longer program as a disadvantage, and they see the opportunity cost of not having a salary and being out of employment for that long. They see a shorter program is actually more.
Sorry, I think we lost Eric. In that, and I'm going to ask a quick question here, Andrew. Like, in terms of, we were talking about the full-time programs, the flagship programs. And I know that FT ranks the other modes of programs as well, the online and the executive program and so on. What are you seeing there?
Well, as you know, we rank both executive MBAs and online MBAs, which is the next one of our rankings to come out. I think, first of all, if you like, the boundaries, the definitions are in flux at the moment. So, as you say, kind of, perhaps there was a simpler period when, there was a real distinction between a in-person full-time MBA and the part-time and online or hybrid models. I think now those sort of whole models are moving into a much more hybrid fluid form. So it becomes more challenging, really, to sort of define the boundaries. I think, you'll find probably even in most of the full-time in person, there will be a lot more online resources to catch up, to prepare in advance, to allow as a contingency if somebody falls ill or for whatever other reason has to travel or can't take part in in-person classroom discussions. So in the online space, it's huge, of course, and there seems to be, if one looks at the latest surveys, growing interest, particularly in those sorts of programs where you can study part-time, continue to work, raise your family, and not have to move. I think there's a real value in at least some in-person aspect to that, whether it's in multiple hubs, perhaps in different regions of the country or the world, so that people can meet each other face to face, because that is a really unreproducible, invaluable additional experience. But I think over time we're going to see more and more variable duration, variable format type approaches. Executive MBAs still do very well, I think, in part because obviously there is an appetite for career change, for people thinking perhaps about moving employer, changing their role, thinking about shifting to a startup, moving country or sector or whatever it might be. And of course, those programs have long had this more staggered approach, part-time executives who are still working, periodic travel and meet up in different parts of the world, sometimes coupled with online learning. So I think those areas we're going to see continue to grow, much smaller, of course, in terms of absolute numbers of participants compared to the classic traditional MBA, but where that's stagnating, those other ones are definitely growing and evolving.
I think, and you're going to be showing this more in the Spotlight on MBA that FT is hosting on February 21st.
Yes, I mean, obviously, we can share links to that. This is a free webinar we've done now for the last 3 years, a deep dive to talk with Leo, my colleague, on the rankings. And then we also have kind of opportunities for some more detailed discussions with different business school faculties on a range of themes that touch on MBAs. So talking about particularly a session for students on how they should navigate it, to advice from admissions officials, for example. We're going to talk about the wider picture, if you like, the sort of expertise that business schools can provide of value by focusing in with some leading faculty on economics and geopolitics and how that's touching the world of business and its evolution. We'll talk about career mapping, so paths post-graduation. We'll talk about AI and emerging technologies, which is, of course, perhaps the hottest topic, both for study for the nature of evolving business and the skills that need to be learnt, and also actually its applications within learning, the use of AI, generative AI in particular. So a range of different sessions over a half day that we would invite everyone here to register and join for free, alongside, of course, the rankings and the other business education content that we're doing.
Absolutely. So that was February 25th?
That's 21st. On the 21st.
Yeah.
21st. Yeah, I'll be here. Apologies to everyone for the disconnection I had before. And Andrew and I are both in New York, and there's a blizzard going on right now. So I'm wondering, that's why you've been frozen here and there sometimes too. Although your sound has been perfect. Sometimes your screen...
It's just stopped snowing by the look of it. The sun's come out. That's good news.
Exactly. Oh, nice. Yeah, the snow stopped here too. But it was pretty intense. Beautiful. Yeah, what I was saying when I got cut off is one thing I really appreciate about the FT rankings, you can kind of like build your own ranking where you can like sort of edit out certain criteria and focus on the ones you want and filter, it's great. You can learn so much from it. At the same time, as I always tell my clients, you take it with a grain of salt, right? This is not like someone else's priorities and methodology is not necessarily aligned with yours. So you can learn a lot of things from these rankings, but you hopefully are not basing your entire decision on where you go to business school on a ranking. There's so many more things in finding the right fit. I think it's an important message. I usually tell people it's a great place to start, but by the time you go deeper in the research, you will often find other things that are going to really connect with and you feel are the right fit for you. So they have a great place in the business school world. And I think the best reason for having rankings, they always push and encourage schools to do better and to be better, serving their students and their alumni communities. So I salute you for your work, and thank you so much. That's about all the time we have today, unless there's any other questions anyone want to ask. Or Andrew, if you have any comments, going once, going twice.
Well, I'd certainly reinforce what you say. I mean, I certainly wouldn't claim that any ranking is the be all and end all. To make a decision to stop work, probably to give up 1 or 2 years potentially full time, to pay a very substantial premium for tuition and other costs and so on, and the intense workload required is very significant. As you know, I mean, so therefore we provide that full range from rankings, from reporting, from our awards, from the webinars that you mentioned, and indeed also we have this sort of MBA 101 course of 6 emails as well with wider advice, including on resources and ways to, for example, take a trial GMAT to see the sorts of tests that you might be put through in your application process, and indeed in study afterwards. So lots of resources we provide, lots of other great resources out there. No substitute for individual contact and tailoring and understanding your specific needs, and talking to those who've been through different business schools, particularly currently or recently, to really understand the depth and range of offerings, because there is so much variety that it really pays to invest some time to think through what would be best for you.
Absolutely. Yeah, the alumni contact, using LinkedIn as a tool for the research process, I mean, it's just required homework. Absolutely. If you're not doing that, you're missing the boat. So
Andrew, are we going to see you again next year with the global rankings? Many other rankings are going out.
What you're stopping, you mean? I don't think you'll see.
Many other global rankings are out already, and you know who they are. So are you guys still going to be around next year?
Oh, I think there's no doubt we're going to be around. Yeah, I mean, we've got a long-term commitment to this work around business education, including rankings, because we do think metrics and data are a fundamental part of the story. So yes, I hope if I perform, that you'll be kind enough to invite me back next year, and we can discuss more on all this.
Yep, you've been great. Absolutely. All right, we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Andrew, of course, for joining us today. It was really good to see you and to learn all about what you had to say. Don't forget to tune in next week. Every Tuesday, MBA Waves brings to you great topics all about business and education, puts you in touch with some of the best schools out there, and we dive into some really great topics like how to write essays, how to get your CV MBA ready, getting ready for interviews. Next week, you're getting into the GRE. So we have Jay Bryant from ETS joining us. So for the whole schedule, go to mbawaves.com and see you next Tuesday. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.